The executive power shall be vested in President of the United States. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with the Vice President chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. Now, Clause 2 and 3 are the clauses that establish the Electoral College that, again, then describe in great detail exactly how the Electoral College is to work. And again, this is something I'm just going to let you know where it is and in general, but it was written by lawyers and it is very dense. In Clause 5, it stipulates that the qualifications to be President of the United States. No person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of the Constitution shall be eligible to the office of President, nor shall any person be eligible to that office who shall have not attained the age of 35 years and have been 14 years of resident within the United States. Okay, so this is, again, one of the categories of citizen I mentioned is natural-born citizen. And that means, again, you are a person who was born within the jurisdiction of the United States. Now, it's important to understand the idea of being born within the jurisdiction of the United States does not mean you have to be born within the territorial limits of the United States. Okay? So the idea then is if you were born on an American military base in some other country, the military base is within the jurisdiction of the United States. That's why it's understood that if you attack an American military base in another country, you are attacking the United States. And so if you are then, like a good example of this is the late John McCain. John McCain was born in Panama on an American military base. His father was a high-ranking officer in the U.S. military. They lived on the base in Panama. His father and mother lived on that base. And when it was time for John McCain to be born, he was born on that military base, which then meant even though he was born in Panama, he was born within the jurisdiction of the United States because he was born on that military base. Had he been born in Panama itself, like in Panama City, then he would not be a natural-born citizen. But he was born on that military base. And so then, this is the one exception where a naturalized citizen is ineligible to be president of the United States. Because again, a naturalized citizen was born in another country, but then they came here to become a citizen of the United States. And so this is, again, where recently it almost flared up into controversy. If any of you remember the election of 2016, Texas Senator Ted Cruz had thrown his hat in the ring and was running for the Republican Party's nomination. Well, Ted Cruz was born in Canada. Both of his parents were citizens of the United States. I believe his mother was a natural-born citizen, but his father was a naturalized citizen from Cuba. But they were both, his parents were living in Canada. And when Ted Cruz was born, he was born in Canada. Now, when you are born in another country, but both of your parents are citizens, the advantage that child has is they are instantly naturalized. If you are going through the process that most people go through to be naturalized citizens, there's an application process involved, and then there's a waiting period of about 5 years that you have to go through before you can complete the process and become a naturalized citizen. If your parents are already citizens, but you're born in another country, you are instantly naturalized. Okay? But you are still a naturalized citizen, which means you're not eligible to be president of the United States. Now, I do remember the election of 2016, and I wondered about this a whole lot. And a lot of people were beginning to raise the issue as Ted Cruz made it further and further along in the primary process, getting closer to the nomination. But then he withdrew from the campaign. He withdrew from the race, and that made it all moot. Okay? And so the idea then is that this is something that some people think we've lived beyond it, that we need to change this, and it would take a constitutional amendment. But again, this is something that only applies to the first generation of naturalized citizens. Like, for example, Ted Cruz has 2 daughters who were born here in Texas. So both of his children are natural-born citizens of the United States. Any one of his daughters, both of his daughters, could grow up and become president of the United States. And again, it's only, that first generation who become a naturalized citizen. Then if they then have all of their children born within the jurisdiction of the United States, then all of their other children are natural-born citizens. Now, again, naturalized citizens can hold any other office other than president or vice president. They can be elected to Congress, they can be elected to the Senate, they can be appointed to the Supreme Court, they can be governors of the state, members of state legislatures, they can be elected to the courts, any federal court they can be appointed to, they can be Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense. Again, any and every other office in the United States, naturalized citizens are eligible. As long as, if you go back to Article 1, you've met that requirement, you have to be at least 7 years a citizen to be a member of the House. You have to at least be 9 years a citizen to be a member of the Senate. Okay? So those are the only limitations on naturalized citizens. Okay? This came up again in the context of when Arnold Schwarzenegger was considered to be a very popular, very successful governor of California. And he was a Republican who was serving as governor of California, and the Republican Party wanted him to run for president of the United States as a Republican. But Schwarzenegger made it clear to the Republican Party that he was ineligible to be president of the United States. They should have known that. Maybe they did, but they're just hoping, they were just keeping their fingers crossed. But Schwarzenegger was born in Austria. And he grew up in Austria. He came to the United States, I believe, when he was about 18 or 19 years old. So now he has been a naturalized citizen for decades. That, again, did not stop him from being governor of California. And, again, it does stop him from being president of the United States. So, This establishes the succession of the presidency. In case of the removal of the president from office or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the same shall devolve on the vice president, and the Congress may provide for the case of removal, death, resignation, or inability, and so on. Now, the president shall be stated at times to receive for his services a compensation which shall neither be increased nor diminished during the period for which he shall have been elected, and he shall not receive within that period any other emolument from the United States or any of them. So, there's that word again. Okay? So, this establishes the president gets a paycheck. Once he gets elected, his pay cannot be raised, and it cannot be lowered. And the president is specifically prohibited from getting any other emolument. The reason the framers of the Constitution went to such lengths to make this clear is they wanted the president to only be beholden to the United States for his salary. The problem is when anyone pays you anything, there is, understandably, there's felt to be an obligation to that person who has paid you that money. And so the only entity that the framers of the Constitution wanted the president to feel obligated to is the United States. So this again, when you combine it with what we looked at in Article 1, it says, no person holding any office of profit or trust under them, which would then include the President of the United States, without the consent of Congress, except of any person, emolument, office, or title. So again, theoretically, a person can receive an emolument. A member of Congress, the president can receive a gift, but they have to get the permission from Congress. Now, the way it generally works today is if the president gets a gift from a foreign country, a foreign ruler, and that gift is considered to be valued at $250 or less, the president can keep that gift without question. But if there's any reason to believe that that gift may be worth more than $250, then they can still receive the gift, but at that point they have to report the gift to Congress. And Congress will then have to, there's a whole process already set in place in Congress where then they go through, they review. Does the person who sent the gift to the president have any business before the government of the United States? Are they advocating for any particular law to be passed by the United States? If the answer is yes to either of those questions, then that makes the gift too much like a bribe. So Congress would say, no, you can't receive that gift. Okay? And so, the other thing that this brings into bear is that, again, a lot of this language has lost its meaning to us in our world because things have changed so much. And so let's look closely at this wording. No person holding any office of profit or trust. Okay? So those are two different kinds of offices, an office of profit and an office of trust. An office of profit meant you were guaranteed a salary. Okay? Meaning that you were going to get paid and you would be paid well for your service. If you were in an office of trust, then that meant you were not getting paid for the work you did. And so they were, again, then trusting you to do your job, to do it correctly, to do it morally and ethically, even though you weren't getting paid for the job. Now, even though when we go back and look at the Article 1, and only because this is part of this discussion, it says the senators and representatives shall receive a compensation for their services to be ascertained by law and paid out of the Treasury of the United States. For several decades of early American history under this Constitution, members of Congress were serving in positions of trust. In other words, they weren't getting paid a salary. There was simply not a law established giving members of Congress a salary until the mid-1850s. Prior to the mid-1850s, what members of Congress were allowed is what we call a per diem. And this is a Latin phrase, so you often see it underlined or italicized. And what a per diem roughly translates to is a daily expense. So what that meant is that members of Congress were, for example, they were compensated for their meals. I should say they were recompensated for their meals. So if you were a member of Congress, you would pay for your meals during the day, but you would collect your receipts, turn them into the government office in Congress. The receipts would be reviewed, and then the total amount of those receipts would then be paid back to the member of Congress. So you would still have to pay for your daily expenses up front, but there was a system in place for you to get your money back if you chose to. And so some members of Congress were wealthy enough to where they didn't even bother. It was a hassle to keep up with receipts. Okay? But they did not get paid for any other work. This is where the idea of Congress as a public service, where you are fulfilling a service, you are fulfilling a duty, an obligation. And these kinds of duties, these kinds of this idea of service and obligation generally means it's coming without compensation. But the wording in Article 2 of the president shall at stated times receive for his services a compensation which shall neither be increased nor diminished. This is not an option. This is a requirement. Because again, they want the president to be compensated for the work he does as president, and therefore under no pressure to try to seek financial remuneration from any other source. And so the president today receives $450,000 a year. That's their salary. They get paid twice a month. Okay. And again, the way it generally works is the president is issued a credit card. And so what happens is today the check is a direct deposit. The president goes out, and if the president buys something, like a meal, well, then he's compensated. So the way that works is that he would pay for that meal with that White House credit card. And then when the White House credit card bill is received by the White House, well, then they go through the bill. And if there's any expense that is not a legitimate part of the president's duty, official duties, then that is taken out of his paycheck. If it is paid for, if it is part of his official duties, his daily expenses, then it's paid for by the Treasury Department. So several years ago, President Obama was out and he was being interviewed. And so he invited the interviewer to go with him to lunch. He revealed to the interviewer that one of his favorite places to go to lunch was Five Guys Burgers and Fries. And so that's where they went. So when President Obama was buying his lunch, he also bought the lunch for the interviewer, and he bought everyone's lunch who was in the restaurant. Now, when that credit card bill was received by the White House, the Treasury Department paid for President Obama's lunch. But out of the president's own salary money, his own income, the reporter's lunch and the lunch for everyone else in the restaurant was paid for. Okay? So that's how it works. And because we live in a partisan world and have been for such a long time, if you are someone who wants to give a gift to the White House, but you do not want that gift to be given to the President of the United States because you are politically opposed to them, well, then you can make that clarification. When you give the gift, you can make it clear. This gift is going to the President of the United States. Or you can say, this gift is going to the White House. So then what difference that will make is that if it's a gift to the president, then when that president leaves office, they can take that with them because that was their gift. But if the gift is to the White House, the gift must stay in the White House. It cannot be taken by the president when they leave office. Okay? So this is, again, something that allows for, if you have the opportunity to give a gift, but you are politically and philosophically opposed to the person who is actually serving as president at that time, then make your gift to the White House. Okay, now let's talk about term limits in the presidency. The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years. But again, there's no limit mentioned of how many 4-year terms the president can have. So now, what happens is when George Washington was president of the United States, he was elected president for 1 term, he was elected president for 2 terms, a 2nd term, and then he was under tremendous pressure to take a 3rd term. But Washington will refuse to take that 3rd term, and in doing so, he will say, 2 terms is enough for any one president. Now, that became what's known as the 2-term tradition. And coming from someone who, like George Washington, who was the first president, who's still always been among the most revered presidents in the United States, that tradition was virtually impossible to break. And so this established for a very long time presidents having only 2 terms, even though technically they could have more. On the handout that talked about the compromises, I gave you this note where I talk about this. President George Washington established a 2-term tradition by refusing to take a 3rd term as president of the United States. President Thomas Jefferson reinforced this tradition, and it was followed by every American president since the days of Washington and Jefferson. The 2-term tradition, however, was not followed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He served office from 1933 until 1945. The combined crisis caused by the Great Depression and the Second World War led Roosevelt to be elected to an unprecedented 4 terms as president of the United States. So again, Roosevelt wasn't doing anything wrong. Breaking a tradition is not the same as breaking the law. Okay? And again, the idea was because we went from the Depression right into World War II, a majority of Americans were simply comfortable having the same person in charge. Having the same person who was in charge of the government during the Depression, he would be in charge during World War II. Now, that was the first time any American president had gone beyond 2 terms. So, in 1952, the 22nd Amendment was added to the Constitution, mandating that the president would, from that point forward, be limited to 2 consecutive terms in office. Once the president served a 2nd term, they were ineligible for that office. Now, again, to be clear, it doesn't have to be consecutive. You're allowed 2 terms. Now, most of the time, it's 2 consecutive terms. Okay? So, the idea then is, Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, and he served only 1 term because he lost the election in 2020. And so now, he is eligible for that 2nd term. And theoretically, President Biden, he was nominated, he received the nomination, but then he withdrew. So he will now have only 1 term. Theoretically, I doubt it will ever happen, but theoretically, he could run for another term as president at some point in the future. But he's old. He probably won't. He won't. Anyway, so now there is a constitutionally required limit on 2 terms for any one president. So that tradition is now firmly in the Constitution. And this is something else to bear in mind, because when you sometimes hear people claiming we need to have term limits for members of Congress. Again, if you look at the language of Article 1, there are no limits on how many terms a member of Congress can have. There are no limits on how many terms a senator can have. So the only way to establish term limits is to establish an amendment, add an amendment to the Constitution that would limit members of Congress to a specific number of terms. Okay? And that is we'll talk about the amendment process here shortly, but the requirements to get an amendment are extremely difficult to achieve. And it's very unlikely that any member of Congress, that you have enough support in Congress to establish term limits to get a constitutional amendment passed. So generally a politician calling for term limits in Congress, they are either blowing smoke or they're stupid. Neither of which is good. Okay? Now, let's go back. This is also something I want you to be aware of, because it is important. Before he enter the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Okay? I think it would be a safe bet if you asked a lot of people, is it the President's responsibility to protect us? To protect you and me? That a lot of people would say, yeah, that's the President's job. But it's not. It's the Constitution that protects us.